It's The World This Week, The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. Joining us from London, Nico Hines, world editor of The Daily Beast. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks.
Very well. Good to hear it. Ana Navarro-Pedro, Paris correspondent for Portuguese news magazine Visão. How are things with you?
Great. Thank you.
Great. Oh my God. Very well. Great. Let's see how Rob Parsons is doing, our chief international affairs editor.
I'm well, too.
Well, too. Okay. Surely from Amsterdam, Stefan de Vries, correspondent for French financial daily Les Echos and European affairs correspondent at Euronews, is doing well as well. Stefan, how are you?
Bonsoir, good evening, Francois. I'm doing very well, thanks.
Very well, okay. Looks like you got a lot of books to read there behind you. The World This Week on Facebook and Twitter. Hashtag
Actually, I wrote them all, actually.
You wrote them all. It took an unwitting decision by UEFA, otherwise delighted that Budapest's been offering full stadium seating capacity for Euro 2020 to bring Hungary's illiberal streak to a head, you might say. Europe's football governing body barring Munich from lighting up the Allianz Arena in rainbow colors to protest Viktor Orban's new anti-LGBT law. Then that triggered protests. The protests had been going on in Budapest. Now it's the rest of the EU that's paying attention.
For me, Hungary has no place in the EU anymore, but I'm not the only one to decide this. There are 26 other members saying you have to leave. This has to be done step by step, and in the meantime, we hope the others adapt.
Hungary has no more place in the EU, Ana Navarro-Pedro?
Well, we were used to the excess language of Netherlands Prime Minister, of course, and his lack of diplomacy as well. Why did all of a sudden this summit veer off to trash Hungary? It was quite
an EU summit taking place Thursday and Friday.
Yes, and it's quite extraordinary. I don't know. We can instead of going just behind the emotion aroused by this situation, maybe we could think that maybe this is not the best angle to attack Hungary's Orban. In the past, European Union hasn't been so vehement, so powerful, with so much powerful words when there is censorship, when the press is silenced, when there is no more liberty of expression, when refugees are treated badly. When some other human rights are not respected in Hungary. And all of a sudden we go behind something that is very fashionable right now, defending the rights, of course, of minorities, LGBT. But we've noticed only 17 countries in European Union have followed this trend. 10 others have kept silent.
Well, one of those is your native Portugal, but that's because they're the current rotating presidency of the EU, and so they're not supposed to vote on these matters.
Yeah, this is for Portugal, of course. But there is maybe an ideological angle of attack here that is not perhaps the most efficient concerning Hungary and concerning other countries in Eastern Europe that are not respecting the rules of membership to the European Union. I don't know. I think that this might end up in a boomerang action against the rest of European Union, but we'll see.
So why boomerang in the sense that it helps Viktor Orban more?
Because it's his main way of living, of scoring political
points. Nico Hines, so what if Viktor Orban makes political hay out of this domestically? Should the EU be speaking out and using as strong a language as we've heard there from the Dutch Prime Minister?
Yeah, I think it's good to see the EU speaking out. I think it kind of shows the weakness of their position, that their ultimate kind of, the strongest words they've used is that you should just leave the EU yourselves, which kind of is almost an admission that there's not much they can do about it. And I mean, I think to be fair, that the EU is pretty clear about the fact that it's a financial body essentially, and it cares about the economics of its member states, but basically doesn't intervene too much politically, which I suppose is, fair enough. But it does strike us slightly odd when you're trying to impose rules on member states. They are supposed to be their own democracies, however disgusting or distasteful they may be.
Yeah, well, again, this is a law that effectively makes it illegal in any public forum to talk about homosexuality in the name of protecting children. Most poignant was the closed-door Thursday night summit dinner in Brussels, where Viktor Orban crossed paths with Luxembourg's gay prime minister.
My conclusion after the speech was to remember a dinner I had 5, 6, 7 years ago with Viktor Orban and my husband in Budapest. I did not recognize the Viktor Orban sitting across the European Council table today. It's not the same person. He disappointed me a lot, I told him.
All right, so he says he doesn't recognize the Viktor Orban of old. Orban insists he is the Viktor Orban of old. He says this bill merely takes discussing homosexuality out of the public realm and makes it a family matter.
I'm a fighter for the rights. I'm a freedom fighter in the communist regime. Homosexuality was punished. And I fought for their freedom and their rights. So I am defending the rights of the homosexual guys. But this law is not about that. It's about the right of the kids and the parents.
Robert Parsons?
Well, there's some truth in what he's saying, because he did have a reputation for defending human rights in communist Hungary, but he's done a massive turn since then. What we're seeing now is just growing exasperation, I think, on the part of the European Union. It's not just about LGBT rights. It's about a whole succession of things, as you're pointing out. It's the attack on the media, the human rights in general, the rigged elections. The list can go on and on and on. And the European Union has been struggling and is still struggling, as we see in its response today and before today, and how to deal with Hungary.
And you heard Nico Hines qualify the EU as, well, first and foremost, an economic trading bloc.
Yeah, but there have been threats to penalise Hungary. But how do you get all the members of the European Union to come together to put that sanction into place? It's not going to happen. We know that. At the very least, Poland is going to support Hungary. But the idea that you should throw Hungary out, very tempting. It's so frustrating to have a country like that, at the core of Europe, going against all the values that the European Union stands for. But it's not about Viktor Orban. It's about the Hungarian people. There are 10 million Hungarian people. Governments change. Once Viktor Orban is out, maybe there'll be a more sympathetic government in place, which is more in tune with Western or European values. So I think the idea of throwing them out is ludicrous.
All right. At his press conference closing the summit, the French president, Emmanuel Macron, went further. He spoke of a cultural and civilizational battle that we must wage.
In several member countries, Hungary, Poland, and others, there's mounting anti-liberal conservatism against our values. It's part of our society, we must respect it. But they're undermining the values that built our Western liberal democracies over the past centuries.
So, Stefan de Vries, it's their values, we must respect them, but they're undermining our values. So what do you do?
Well, the problem is, of course, that we cannot expel any member state. When these countries joined, Hungary, Poland in 2004, we had another treaty. Then in 2007, we had the Treaty of Lisbon, which is still effective today. And in that treaty, we never thought, when we wrote that treaty, that someday member states would actually turn against the same values they had signed during this when they joined the European Union. So we have no instruments. The only thing we can do is to suspend them temporarily. We have this Article 7 in the Lisbon Treaty, which gives the member states the power to suspend member states that do not respect the values and the state of law in the European Union. But the problem is that some countries will probably always support Hungary. So basically, we cannot do a lot. And I would like to nuance the words of the Dutch Prime Minister. He did not say, leave, please go away, or we want to send you away. Actually, what he said is that he does not understand why Viktor Orban signed up to European values and laws, and when he is not respecting them, why does he stay a member of this club? Why doesn't he leave the European Union? Which I think is a very legitimate question, of course, because it is a democratic bloc, the European Union, but it's also a bloc of values. And Nico just mentioned the fact that we are probably, he sees it as an economical bloc, but I think what happened this week is a sort of watershed. It's also the words of Emmanuel Macron you just showed. Angela Merkel, who also said that there are profoundly different ideas about the European Union, that we have a serious problem. And I think it is interesting to see that maybe here this week we are seeing the birth maybe of far more than something economical, that there's also a group of countries, probably the core of the European Union, the member states, the founding member states, the 6 founding members plus probably Spain, Portugal, that think that there's far more than just money at stake or trade, that we're far more than just trade partners. And we're seeing this with this conflict between, well, it's a bit like the former Iron Curtain is there again, but then it's a curtain between morals and also values.
Morals and values. Let me ask you, Nico Heinz, your thoughts on, you know, we saw in Germany the outrage, and the outrage spread to some other EU members with rainbow flags that were put on other stadiums when UEFA barred Munich from putting that display on the Allianz Arena. What's been the reaction where you are?
Well, I think people have been very impressed with the way that, for example, the German football team and the players themselves, you know, Goretzka got that goal which made sure that Hungary were booted out of the Euros. Perhaps they can't be booted out of the EU, but they were kicked out of the Euros football tournament last week. And the guy who scored the goal posted on Instagram a picture of himself holding up a kind of heart symbol and saying love to all. And the message was pretty clear to Hungary that they're on the wrong side of the debate when it comes to Western Europe. And I do think that the discussion that has taken place in Brussels today will have a kind of long-term impact on Hungary, and that people will realise there might be a quick political gain for Orban to kind of, you know, make bellicose statements in response, which might buoy up his supporters in Hungary. But I think over a longer period, I think that influence does seep down into member states of the EU, and perhaps one day the EU will become an important moral force in the world. I think at the moment it's not. It can't even stand up to, you know, really obvious bad guys like Russia. It's busy signing up for this pipeline so that cheap gas can be pumped into Central Europe. Who cares the fact that the guy who's going to be profiting from that is having people murdered, assassinated and poisoned? The Europeans are too busy counting their money in the banks.
Ana Navarro Pedro, speaking of money in the bank, you can hurt people in their wallets. We can show you the tweet of one crusading anti-Orban member of the European Parliament, Catalan. She's been very vocal about, for instance, 600,000 euros in EU funds that have allegedly been funneled to Orban's son-in-law. Here in this particular tweet, she says, professional tip for the European Council leaders, stop subsidizing his corruption. Well,
that might be a lead to investigate if she can put forward some evidence or some beginning of evidence. Of course, it should be investigated, as some other members of the European Union are being under investigation every so often. but it doesn't apply only to Hungary. Within European, the problem is the contradictions of European Union. See here in this country where we are standing now, France, there has been laws that have been restricting the liberty, the freedom of press as well. If you investigate a company now, you risk very, very heavily if you really use some information. So,
but a law banning the mention of homosexuality, that's not the
same thing. But what I mean is, there are contradictions in European Union in many fields, and they will pop out very, very, very fast.
Robert Parsons?
No, I agree. It's very good.
And by the way, the next presidency of the European Union after
Slovenia.
Portugal is Slovenia, which is also being accused of some of these problems with civil liberties.
Yeah, but I don't think you can put Slovenia in quite the same basket as Hungary at this stage. I mean, maybe on one or 2 points they're in alignment, but by and large, Slovenia doesn't fit into that pocket. I think it's essentially
Emmanuel Macron mentioned it at his press conference.
Well, because on this particular issue, Slovenia appeared to take the side of Hungary, but I think in general, Slovenia has a reasonably good record.
This Friday, by the way, at that EU summit, there was what could be the closing of a 16-year-old chapter.
Okay, Dankeschön und herzliche Grüße, wo immer Sie sitzen.
Barring a change of schedule, it was Angela Merkel's last EU summit before Germany picks a new chancellor in next September's general election. It's interesting, Stefan de Vries, because we mentioned the Dutch Prime Minister, Mark Rutte, we mentioned Viktor Orban. They're the ones who now have the longevity record after Merkel goes inside of the European Council.
Yes, indeed, they do. It's quite ironic that they're probably the biggest antagonists within the European Council. But indeed, Mark Rutte is probably also the reason why he spoke out so clearly, maybe not very diplomatically, as Anna just said, but he feels that he has a role to fulfill. He now has the credibility because he's there already has been there for 11 years. His country is doing extremely well when it comes to the economy. He sees that Europe is important. That's something that he didn't see earlier in his career, but he changed a lot in regard to his look or his opinion on the European Union. Yesterday, actually, he said during this doorstep statement, he said, we cannot allow people like Viktor Orban destroy our beautiful union. It was actually a moment that he came out of the closet, not maybe as a homophile, but as a Europhile, which is maybe even worse at least in Viktor in Hungary. But it is interesting indeed that he's taken the lead. It is also, of course, the fact that the Netherlands has changed, the role of the Netherlands has changed because of Brexit.
So wait, hang on a second. Stefan, are you telling me that when Merkel's not there, when there's a bit of an interregnum in Germany, it's not Macron but Rutte who's going to be the boss of Europe?
Well, the boss, I wouldn't say that. Of course, the problem with the European Union is exactly those national leaders. It is the member states. They are the part of the problem, not of the solution. But I do think that there's also a chemistry between Macron and Rutte. So Macron accepts a lot what Rutte says. And by the way, maybe Macron isn't there anymore either next year, nor Mark Rutte, by the way, because he's not. There's no government currently in the Netherlands. And it's not really entirely sure that he will come back as a prime minister in autumn. So maybe all the people we're seeing today at this summit will be gone in a year or so, maybe even sooner.
I'm going to interrupt you, Stefan, because we have to take
his role that he really takes a lead.
We're going to have to take a quick break. We'll be right back. You're watching The World This Week. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with the Daily Beast. Daily Beast world editor Nico Hines is with us from London. We're also in the company of Ana Navarro Pedro, who's Paris correspondent for Portuguese news weekly Visão. Robert Parsons, France 24's chief international affairs editor. And from Amsterdam, Stefan de Vries, correspondent for French financial daily Les Echos. We heard a little bit of Angela Merkel's swan song at an EU summit, Nico Hines. In the build-up to that summit, Merkel blasted letting more fans into stadium, not in Budapest, but as we're about to hear, in London, where capacity's been increased for the semi-final and the final of Euro 2020.
I don't think it's a good thing that stadiums are full there, and I support any initiative by the UK government to enforce sanitary measures. It's a variant zone, which means that travel is very limited.
What was your reaction when you heard that, Nico Hines?
Well, it's fun. We were talking previously about UEFA being the bad guys with this Hungary protest. And of course, the reason Britain has increased the capacity at Wembley to 45,000 for the next couple of games, and then 60,000, which I think is similar to the Hungary stadium, 60,000 for the semis and the final, is that UEFA said to them, if you don't increase the capacity because it's going to look better on TV, then we're going to take it away from Britain and we're not going to have it in London anymore. We're going to have it in Hungary because all they care about, obviously, is how good this thing is going to look on television. Not only that, they threatened the British government with pulling the games unless they basically lifted all travel restrictions for the UEFA VIPs. So thousands of people are going to come for each of the next 5 games being held in London who don't have to quarantine, don't have to stick to any of the rules. And yeah, it's absolutely appalling. Merkel's right. I suppose you could blame the British government for kowtowing to UEFA, but ultimately it's UEFA's fault. And it comes back, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago when we were all laughing at how awful Bolsonaro was for holding the Copa America in Brazil. Well, holding the Euros across Europe with people, thousands and thousands of fans and people travelling from one capital to another, crisscrossing the continent when we're trying to get a grip of this pandemic is just completely mad.
Yeah, Ana Navarro Pedro, all those French fans we saw in Budapest at the full stadium for France-Portugal.
And the Portuguese were there as well. And now we have the president of Portuguese parliament saying, at that precise moment, we are having a huge outbreak in Lisbon, our capital. Lisbon is cut off from the rest of the country during the weekends in an attempt not to let this wave taking over the country. Well, we have the president of the parliament saying, let's go, thousands of us Portuguese, to Sevilla, where Portugal is going to have a match with Belgium. So the madness that Nikos is talking about is all over Europe. There is no sense. And Mrs. Merkel, Chancellor Merkel, who maybe is advancing herself on the sovereignty of other countries, but she's absolutely right on the sanitary front. She told Portugal could have avoided this problem right now if we had agreed on traveling conditions within European Union for all of the countries, and she's absolutely right to speak out about it.
And then when it comes to the British itself, Robert Parsons, it's a little confusing. Some countries letting in more British people right now with the Delta variant, others restricting more.
It is totally confusing, and there are more statements by the British government today about green and the sort of green, getting rid of orange and red. It's not adding to any clarity whatsoever. But just on the previous point we were talking about, it was interesting that, I'm talking about Britain, there's a document published today which suggests that actually there is not a link. I mean, first of all, I should say I completely sympathise with what Angela Merkel has said. But what this document is saying, there is no link between these big events as spreaders of the coronavirus.
Totally
just published today. Admittedly taken before the Delta variant started spreading.
It's not necessarily in the stadium, but you go to the bar afterwards, right?
Yeah, it's true, yeah.
Can I just very quickly remember everybody of one fact? When the COVID epidemic started off in Italy and Spain in March last year, you remember what was the
There was a Champions League match.
Exactly.
Yeah. Someone has to take the first step. The words of Spain's prime minister, who this week granted a conditional pardon to 9 Catalan separatists who had been given long jail terms over that band's bid for independence back in 2017. Here you see them coming out. They still can't hold public office, and their calls for amnesties have so far been rejected. But still, Pedro Sánchez braving the ire of the courts in Madrid, the opposition, and public opinion.
With this act, we are taking 9 people out of prison, but we are symbolically uniting millions and millions of people for coexistence.
Stefan de Vries, how much of a gamble is Pedro Sánchez taking?
Well, he's taking a gamble also with many Spaniards not living in Catalonia, because a lot of people in Spain reject the claims of Catalonia to independence. I don't know if the risk is really big. Spain is, of course, very differently organized than France, for instance. It's a very decentralized state, so regional movements are stronger than in many other European countries. But if it's a gamble, well, he says it's a new step on rebuilding our country, working together. The Spanish have, of course, the long history of dictatorship. They are only a modern democracy since the mid-70s, member of the European Union since 1986. They've come a very long way. And by granting a pardon to people who are basically in jail because of their political opinions, I think it's a smart move. I don't know whether it will do anything for the national political relations or how people in Spain will react, but at least it is an interesting move. And of course, if you want to get a path towards living together, a national peace, well, peace is maybe a big word, but national calm, maybe that's a better word, then there was no other option than to grant this pardon to these Catalan politicians.
Ana Navarro, Pedro?
Yes, it's a smart move, but it's a move that doesn't satisfy many in Spain.
It's not enough for some and too much for others.
Not enough for some and too much for others. The right wing in Spain is on the uprising now, and as we've seen in recent elections, namely in Madrid. And those are still very nostalgic of the Franquist era, some of them, and there will be some backlash of this pardon, but it is necessary at some point to do a movement, to stretch out a hand and try to start healing this nation, because things have been really in jeopardy in Spain since 2017. The arrest of these members, politicians, for their political opinions is really quite something that doesn't go along with the chart of European Union values, and it has to have a start. And next week, Pedro Sánchez is going to try to start talking again with the authorities in Catalonia. And let's hope this time people in Catalonia will take the hand, stretch it out, and step by little step, maybe things can get healed.
All right, what's the opposite of reconciliation? After first denying that fighting was continuing in Ethiopia's rebel province of Tigray, the government in Addis Ababa owning up to an airstrike that has killed dozens of civilians. It was an Air Force jet hitting a market in a town near the regional capital, Mekele, and with ambulances at first barred from accessing the scene. Well, the army giving its own version.
Our planes have eyes. They can identify who is a civilian and who is a combatant. This is the era of technology. It was a great success. Our heroic Air Force carried out a successful mission.
Robert Parsons, this is the numbers of people killed. It's on par with the Sarajevo market bombing during the Bosnian War.
It's horrific, no doubt about it. The notion that even with advanced technology you can clearly identify who the enemy is and who is not is absurd, as we've seen from wars in Syria and Iraq, and you mentioned Sarajevo as well. You know, the Americans have done it, the Russians have done it, and we saw the same in Bosnia. But we need to be careful, I think, with Ethiopia. it's dealing with an immensely complicated situation. It's a country with no democratic experience, just emerged from decades and decades of authoritarian rule.
Because on Monday we had an election, and it was billed. It wasn't taking place in Tigray, obviously, but it was taking place in other parts. And it was billed as this exercise as a step on the way to democracy.
Yeah, and I think that's probably the way that most people in Ethiopia are saying it. Nobody, I think, believes that after this election that Ethiopia is going to be a perfectly functioning democracy. It's still a long way from that. The hope will be in Ethiopia and in the African Union, which wants to spread democratic governance throughout Africa, that Ethiopia will set an example. On the basis of what we've seen so far in that election, although there are problems, obviously, in Tigray province where nobody was participating, in Oromia also where there was no participation, although that will take place later this year, in September, I think. There are clear problems. And we've seen in Oromia, too, that many politicians have been excluded, but often excluded and imprisoned for their views on wishing to separate the country, the regions from the country. And we've seen in Spain what happens to politicians who try to do that as well. So before we throw stones at the Ethiopian government, we need to look at ourselves a little bit as well. They do have an immensely difficult problem. It is a country that is huge, 100 million people, and made up of lots of different ethnic minorities. It's very difficult if you're moving from an authoritarian government to a democratic one to satisfy everybody and not allow the centrifugal forces that are there to pull the country apart. That said, what we've seen in Tigray has been horrific. The efforts on the part of the Ethiopian government to keep the rest of the world out of the region so that they can get on with what's been happening, the invitation of the Eritrean government and its forces, which have carried out some of the worst atrocities by all accounts, is clearly horrendous.
Clearly horrendous. And you mentioned the international he kept out. It's ambulances that were kept out after this airstrike. That's been roundly denounced by the international community, including by the head of the UN's World Health Organization this Friday, who is the former Ethiopian health minister.
Ambulances were blocked for more than a day from attending the scene and evacuating the wounded for medical care. WHO is currently providing life-saving trauma and surgical supplies to a hospital that's treating survivors who are able to reach care. Attacks on civilians anywhere are completely unacceptable, and so is denying them access to immediate care.
And by the way, Stefan de Vries, he's up for re-election at some point, Tedros, and there he is saying it's unacceptable, the actions of his own government.
Yes, indeed. And of course, it's a very worrying situation. There's also a huge famine in Tigray, almost comparable to the terrible famine in the 1980s when Ethiopia was on all the news everywhere around the world. We even organized at the time the famous Live Aid concerts to help the Ethiopians. And now we're seeing that this famine is back. And it's actually a political instrument as well. If you don't give food to the people, you have political leverage. It's very cynical. And of course, a couple of years ago, we thought that Ethiopia was a country that was on its way to a very stable democracy. But unfortunately, the facts of the last couple of weeks do show us otherwise.
Finally, it's the final edition. After 26 years, Hong Kongers lined up before dawn on Thursday for the last edition of Apple Daily, the pro-democracy newspaper, forced out of business by the freezing of its assets and the jailing of its top execs. Instead of the usual 150,000 copies that were published daily, the last issue of the newspaper selling out, all 1 million copies.
It's not as simple as press freedom. Hong Kong has lost many things this year. I want to leave it for the next generation to read, even though it's a lost history. We don't know if they will come back, but it's our responsibility to let people in the future know about this.
Since the movement in 2019, there haven't been that many options in terms of newspapers, but people could still choose. Now there are fewer and fewer choices. I hope that in the future there will be new media outlets appearing and reporting critically.
Nico Heinz, you and the 4 other news people on this panel, over the last 2 decades, we've often deplored the death of newspapers here and there. This one, though, really stands out.
Yeah, although I was going to say it's always typical that the readers come out of their start spending money on newspapers when they're already dead. But if people could, keep buying a newspaper every day, that would be extremely worthwhile for the industry. But yeah, this is a really, really serious matter. And I think one of the most obvious signs that basically democracy's over in Hong Kong. It's been creeping that way for a while, but if you can't have a free and vibrant press, then that's it, basically. And I think the fact is that Hong Kong has already basically been subsumed by China, and it's too late for anyone to do anything about it. Not that anyone has really tried to stop it happening.
We heard that one young person there interviewed Nico saying, well, maybe there'll be other kinds of news outlets out there.
Yeah, it may be that, some popular kind of startup websites do well, or become, what you see often in Russia, for example, is kind of Telegram channels that have huge followers, and that's ways to get the news around. But that's that doesn't replace a real newspaper that has a proper trained staff, holding a government to account, publishing and being read widely by everybody. You can't replace that with a kind of new breed, and it's a real tragedy.
Stefan de Vries, we began this show talking about that EU summit where the Germans and the French tried and failed to get their fellow members to engage more with Russia. Should we be talking more about China on this continent?
Of course we should. It was also the topic, of course, on the summits 2 weeks ago between the US and the EU, the NATO summit, the G7, of course. But these are words. I mean, in practice, what can we do? We can be shocked. We can say that we cannot accept this, and then China will say, "Well, this is just our business. Mind your own stuff." And yeah, what can we do? I mean, if it weren't for the Chinese, people wouldn't be able to watch this show. For instance, everything we use in daily life, technology, cars, even clothing, everything has at least some parts made in China. So we are completely dependent on China, and if we're too vocal, we risk. Of course, losing a lot of technology, and then we're shooting ourselves in the feet. But at the same time, this is, of course, very worrying, and we've seen that press freedom is eroding around the world, while nobody actually really cares. And only on the last day, just like Nico said rightly, that people care about the press that's going to disappear. But I think we have to be far more vocal, and not only about China, but in many countries, press freedom is under pressure, and we should fight for that as journalists, but also as citizens.
One final word on this. Robert Parsons, what happens to Hong Kong? Does it become a Chinese city like any other?
No, it certainly looks like that. The comparison was made with the media in Russia. China has plenty of experience in how to stifle even the slightest hint of alternative voices, as we've seen in the past. That's what's going to happen in Hong Kong. I suppose if there is a bright side on this, it's the battle, the soft power battle that's going on in the world at the moment. China is very concerned, obviously, about how things are perceived, for instance, in Taiwan. Clearly, anybody in Taiwan at the moment looking at what's happening in Hong Kong is going to say, no, we don't want anything to do with mainland China. We're going to keep going down this path. And I think more broadly than that, around the world, this is a battle that the Chinese are starting to lose.
Anna Navarro-Pedro?
China...
Do you agree with what Rob just said?
I was thinking about something else. China has repossessed 2 territories that were under colonization for centuries, Hong Kong and Macau. Hong Kong from England and that tradition of democracy in England, and Macau from Portugal, and a very, very absolutist and dictator, a country that was a dictatorship for a long time as well. And China is very, very happy with the way Macau is doing, and there is no upheaval, there is no fight in Macau for freedom of expression, for democratic values, and so there is no taking of control of Macau in a stronger way from China. So these two territories, the experience of these two territories and what is happening, and the fracture of the split from history might be interesting to analyze in the future.
All right, we shall see. Anna Navarro-Pedro, I want to thank you so much. I want to thank Robert Parsons, Nico Hines in London, Stefan de Vries in Amsterdam. We want to thank you for being with us here in The World This Week.